Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to chair the second session entitled Threats to Eastern Mediterranean Security at this very important conference. As the chairman of the B'nai B'rith World Center in Jerusalem, which is the permanent representative of B'nai B'rith International in Israel's capital and its public policy arm in Israel, the World Center is continuously engaged in contributing to B'nai B'rith's effort to build relations between Israel and the Hellenic countries of Greece and Cyprus. And this is beyond the excellent government-to-government ties that now thankfully exist. These include conferences on security in the East Mediterranean basin, like this one, conferences that focus on the common history of the Greek and Jewish people, Anybody else coming in? Any latecomers? So focus on the common history of the Greek and Jewish people, such as the conference, Sparta Israel, reviewing an ancient friendship that was held in August in Sparta, and of course our biannual mission to Israel, Cyprus, and Greece with our partners, AHEPA and AHI, represented here, of some of whom I've had the great pleasure of meeting yesterday, some of whom are here for the first time, and I hope you're enjoying yourselves. At least you should make the most of coming here. One of the motivations that have undoubtedly played a role in the turnaround in the relationship is the threat perception by countries in the region. This, among other things, will be addressed by our prestigious panel. And I'll introduce them one by one as we go along, but I'll start with our first speaker, who is Jonathan Spire, a research fellow at JISS, a fellow at the JISS, my reading, my apologies. A fellow at the Middle East Forum and the executive director of the Middle East Center for Reporting and Analysis. Spire is a freelance security analyst for Jane's Intelligence Review and writes the Behind the Lines column at the Jerusalem Post. He's also the author of The Days of the Fall, a reporter's journey into Syria and Iraq wars, which was published by Routledge in 2017, and which deals with his experiences of frontline reporting in Syria and in Iraq during the wars there. And The Transforming Fire, The Rise of the Israel-Islamist Conflict, published by Continuum in 2010. Spire holds a PhD in international relations from my alma mater, actually, London School of Economics, and has a master's degree in Middle East politics from the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. His reporting and analysis of the Middle East has been published in a wide variety of outlets, including The Times, The Wall Street Journal, Foreign Policy, The Atlantic, The New Republic, The Australian, Spectator, and many others. He consults for a variety of bodies in governmental, private, and NGO sectors, and is a frequent guest analyst on electronic media. And Jonathan will speak on the Syrian tragedy. Jonathan, please.
Thanks. Can we get the map, please? I'm asking you to, yeah. Okay, so I'll begin my talk. I asked for a map, which is pretty important to the talk, so hopefully the map will shortly be with us. Yeah. With regard to introduction, then, let me say the following. It has become a cliche of media coverage of the Syrian war to say that the Syrian wars are currently in a process of winding down. There's some truth to this, but the picture needs to be complicated. There have been, in essence, two conflict systems taking place in Syria over the last 8 years. One of them is, so to speak, the child of the other, or the product of the other. The first of these is, of course, the war between the Assad regime and the mainly Sunni Arab rebellion raised against it, which began, of course, with initially as an unarmed uprising in March 15th, 2011, beginning in Daraa province, and rapidly morphed into an insurgency. And the second is the product of the first. The second is, of course, the war between the Islamic State and the global coalition raised against it, which has been taking place mainly in the eastern part of Syria since 2014. Now, the issue is that the optimists who speak of wars winding down are partially right. Both these conflicts are indeed winding down. Both of them are reaching some point of conclusion. And it's interesting to note that both of them are reaching a conclusion with clear winners and clear losers. That is to say, the Assad regime, has clearly proven victorious against the rebellion raised against it. The rebellion holds on, of course, in a small part of the northwest of the country and a small part of the south of the country, but in each of these cases it does so only because of the support or patronage of an important global power, Turkey in the northwest and the United States in the Al-Tanf base and the area around it in the south. But it's worth remembering that the rebellion came into being not in order to occupy or take control of a small outlying part or parts of Syria. On the contrary, it came into being in order to destroy the Assad regime and replace it to rule Syria from Damascus. This is no longer an option, no longer a possibility, and the only question remaining for the rebellion is, will it indeed continue to hold on in these two outlying parts of the country, thanks to American and Turkish patronage, or will it eventually be destroyed in its entirety, and will the Assad regime return to control the entirety of Syria? So the result of the regime rebel war has already been decided, and what remains is to sort out the remaining details. With regard to the ISIS coalition war, similarly, the caliphate, as declared by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi on June 29th, 2014, in the Al-Nuri Mosque in Mosul, is extremely close to complete eclipse. That is to say, it is going from controlling an area of land which at its height took in an area roughly the size of Great Britain, roughly the size of the island of Great Britain, down to what remains today, which is a few suburbs of the town of Hajin in the lower Euphrates River Valley. So once again, the coalition is victorious over ISIS. ISIS is not going to disappear as a network, of course, but as a quasi-state, it is close to eclipse. Thus far with regard to conflicts winding down. Of course, what is not taking place in Syria is that as a result of conflicts winding down, Syria is going to return to clear and good governance. Well, there was never good governance in Syria, but to clear governance. Syria is not even going to return to a situation of bad governance in the context of continued dictatorship. Rather, what we see in the Syrian context as these two conflict systems wind down is a situation of confused fragmentation of the country, in which we see Syria effectively collapsed into a series of areas of control, which I want to go on to outline to you now. And if we look at the areas of control, even then we see quickly, if we look into detail at them, that these areas of control are not primarily controlled by internal Syrian factors. Rather, each of them consists of an internal Syrian factor whose survival is underwritten and made possible only because of the involvement of powerful external factors who have come into Syria in their various forms in the time of the war of the last 8 years. And what we are witnessing in Syria today, as I want to now go on to describe, is a whole series of new conflicts and new contests taking place on Syrian soil between these areas of control and the various international factors that underwrite them. And these emergent conflicts are the ones that are defining Syria in the period now opening up. And at this point, I really would like to get the map that I asked for. So if we can get that there, it would be of deep assistance to me. Without that, my talk is not so very good. So, very good. A miracle. It is the time of miracles, as we know, or at least the time has just finished. So we've just witnessed another one. Wonderful. So you can see the map in front of you, and you can see that the map is divided according to colors. And what these colors show, is the number of areas of control. Let me then talk about each of these areas of control. But first of all, let me introduce them for those who may not be familiar with what they are seeing. The area in pink and red in the middle here is the area controlled by the Assad regime And as I mentioned, there are international powers underwriting each of these areas. This is the area underwritten, so to speak, by Russia and by Iran. I'll go on in a moment to deal with each in detail, but just to introduce them, so to speak, first of all. Second in size is here. This yellow area is the area controlled by the Syrian Kurds, specifically by the Kurdish PYD party and its allies, and is underwritten, of course, by the United States, which has put together the coalition of military groups called Syrian Democratic Forces as the armed force, effectively, of that area. Thirdly, we have the two areas which I mentioned in the introduction, still controlled, well, kind of controlled by the Syrian rebels, but mainly controlled by the rebels and their patrons. Down here is the Al Tanf base, controlled by United States Special Forces, with, I think, presence of British and Norwegian Special Forces also. What you can see around here, this green area, is a 55-kilometer radius around the base. This is just empty desert. There's nobody living here. A 55-kilometer radius around the base, which the Americans have defined as a fire zone, i.e. anybody who comes any closer than that, and a few people have, will get shot at by the Americans and their allies. Up here, maybe more intricately and interestingly, this stretch of green stretching from here all the way around, that's the former Afrin canton, and down here into Idlib province, is the area controlled by the rebels. And we can further subdivide this area into two separate, they kind of done it in slightly different greens. You can see kind of slightly paler green here, darker green here. This area up here, close to the border, is the area carved out by Turkey, which is now under direct Turkish control, carved out by Turkey in the two military operations, Operation Euphrates Shield in August 2016 and Operation Olive Branch in January of this year. So this paler green area is under direct Turkish control. And then going further south, this is the area still nominally controlled, the last remaining area, so to speak, nominally independently controlled by the rebels themselves, a variety of different rebel groups, stretching down famously into Idlib province. This last bit of grey here is what remains to the Islamic State. Again, it's empty desert we're looking at there. So what it is not an area of municipal control, but rather an area of desert in which the Islamic State continues to operate. And of course, the people who created the map think that this area in blue here is also part of Syria. Probably many of us here would disagree. That area in blue is, of course, the Golan Heights. To go into a little bit of detail then with regard to these various entities. First of all, the regime-controlled entity. The pre-war population of Syria, perhaps well known to some people here, was thought to be around 23 million, or was around 23 million. Around 6 million people have left Syria in the course of the war, so we can today talk about probably a population of 17 million people. In this area here, again, these are roundups because we can't do a population census at the moment, but the general figure given, around 10 million people living in this regime-controlled area. It contains, of course, the main cities of the country, Damascus here, Homs here, Hama, up to Aleppo. It contains the coastline of the country. You can see here the Mediterranean coast, which, of course, the regime never lost control of. It's worth remembering that this coastal area is important to the regime, not only from a strategic point of view, access to the sea, but also from a demographic point of view. This is Latakia province, which is the heartland of the Alawi communities of Syria, from which, of course, the Assad regime emerges. Thus far, with regard to the makeup of that area, of course, once again to note, it's only possible to maintain that area as a result of the presence of Russian and Iranian forces, Russians in the air for the most part, the Iranians on the ground. Second, and equally interesting area we mentioned, the Kurdish controlled, or Kurdish and American controlled, perhaps we can say, area now. As you can see, stretching all the way down, this is the Euphrates River line, all the way down to here, to Al-Qaim, Al-Kamal, the borders with Iraq. Population of that area, probably around 4 million people. It's just right now clearing up the last presence of ISIS down here. You can't really see Hajin on the map. That's the last area of presence of ISIS, which those forces have been fighting. The position of the Russians and Iranians with regard to the regime is very clear. They support the regime-controlled area, and they're staying to support it. They regard the regime-controlled area as the legitimate government of Syria, and therefore they regard themselves as legitimate, having been invited in by the legitimate government of Syria. The position of the Americans with regard to this area, a little bit more ambiguous. As you may remember, President Trump, in April of this year, guaranteed to bring US forces home by the end of the year, but that statement has been walked back on several occasions since. by senior officials, not really by Trump himself, but by senior officials, including Bolton, Pompeo, most recently Jim Jeffrey and Dunford, the chief of staff also, just in recent days. The impression, for now at least, is that the Americans are staying in that area. They've just recently begun the construction of 3 observation points along the Turkish border, ostensibly to stop the Kurds from firing at the Turks, but Turkey is deeply unhappy about that and regards it probably accurately as a statement of an American desire to stick around for longer. If we check the statements by American officials with regard to this area and American intentions, it's interesting to note a transition in recent weeks. A few weeks ago, officials would say, well, ISIS is not completely defeated yet, and in any case, you need to stick around for the reconstruction period post-ISIS, so we need to keep some kind of forces there. In the most recent statements, by contrast, what we've heard is that there's a need to stick around in that area as part of an emergent regional strategy to roll back the Islamic Republic of Iran, right? The logic being that this, which Major General Golan hinted at also in his talk this morning, the logic being, you're all well aware of the Iranian desire to build a contiguous corridor of Iranian control all the way from Iraq-Iran border through Iraq, through Syria, to Lebanon, to Israel, and to the sea. This area, of course, bisects to a great extent, that it goes north to south, bisecting that east to west desire for control. So it constitutes a kind of strategic block or obstacle to that Iranian intention. And in addition, what it also does, of course, is it gets you a place at the table in any conceivable future diplomatic process over Syria, because if you control territory on the ground, nobody can ignore you, particularly when we note, and we should note this, that this area here contains between 80 to 90% of Syria's oil and gas reserves. The regime very much wants to get its hands on those. It contains, of course, the main water area and also some of the best arable land in Syria. Thus far with regard to the second entity. Third, the rebel-controlled areas. As I mentioned, these rebel-controlled areas are only really able to survive today because of the presence and the underwriting of them, so to speak, by the Republic of Turkey, by the Turkish government. The Turkish government was one of the, perhaps even, well, certainly one of the very first states to get behind the rebellion in the early days of its emergence in 2011-2012. Turkey has been a staunch backer of the rebellion all the way through. And Turkey, I think, is determined to prevent the humiliation and complete defeat, or wishes to prevent the humiliation and complete defeat of the rebellion, also because, not least because, is around 3.5 million people in that area. And if there were to be an all-out assault by the regime and the Russians and their allies on that area, it would very probably result in the beginnings of a new refugee crisis as refugees headed towards the north and towards Turkey. Thank you. We mentioned already this last piece here is, of course, the Islamic State. I won't go into a huge amount of detail on that. Islamic State about to disappear, not disappearing as a networked insurgency. And this is very important to remember. ISIS is disappearing as a quasi-state. The caliphate is disappearing. ISIS as a networked insurgency with plenty of money, plenty of fighters, plenty of weaponry is not disappearing. The most recent studies suggest ISIS probably still has around $400 million available to it, has around 30,000 fighters in the Iraq and Syria area, and of course no shortage of weaponry. I was reporting actually in Iraq a couple of weeks ago, and we visited an area in which ISIS is seeking to get reorganized, but because of shortage of time, I won't spend a huge amount of time on that. I wanted to go on then in the final 5 minutes to trace quickly the emergent new conflicts I spoke about that are taking place on that map, so to speak, between a variety of players. Quickly then going from north to south. First of all, already mentioned it, we have an emergent conflict between Turkey and Turks and Kurds, so to speak, on the soil of northern Syria. It's hard to remember, I mean, it's only 8 years, but it's hard to remember. Many people were not even aware prior to 2011 that there was even a Kurdish minority in Syria. You know, they were perhaps the least heard of and most subjugated, so to speak, Kurdish minority of all. It's an astonishing transformation that in the last 8 years, that almost forgotten minority has gone on to become really a key geostrategic player, or strategic player, so to speak, in the Syrian context. The reason for that, of course, is because the Americans, having cast about for a ground partner in the war against ISIS, came upon the Kurdish YPG and found it to be a reliable ground partner, and of course one deeply opposed to the ideologies of Islamism, which it was also looking to oppose. A result of that, however, has been the emergence of Turkish-Kurdish conflict on Syrian soil, because as far as Turkey is concerned, the Kurdish YPG and PYD is regarded simply as an arm of the PKK organization, with which, of course, Turkey has been in conflict since 1984, at the cost of many tens of thousands of lives. So there is now an emergent contest between Turks and Kurds on the soil of Syria, as we see, as we said, let me get this right. The Kurds are up to here, and the Turks are right here, so they're brushing up against one another right there in the town of Menbij, just west of the Euphrates River, and that's a conflict with some way to go. As a result of that first emergent new conflict, there is a second, not new conflict, but new contest between, of course, Turkey and the United States, two NATO partners who nevertheless have a deeply differing view regarding the future of northern Syria because of the alliance between the United States and its Kurdish allies, who I just mentioned. Thirdly, there is an emergent conflict between regime and Kurds on the soil of Syria. Why? Again, you can look at the map and it's fairly obvious. Look at the pink and look at the yellow. Assad regards himself as the legitimate ruler of the entirety of Syria. The Kurds wish to stick around for a while east of the Euphrates, so there's going to be a conflict there of wills between the two. Fourthly, an emergent conflict between the regime and Turkey on the soil of Syria. Again, for similar reasons, Turkey committed to the survival of the rebellion in the areas marked in green on the map. Syria, or Assad, determined to reconquer those. Fifthly, between Russia and US, again, Russia with its client Assad, determined to reunite the country under his rule. The Americans apparently wishing to stick around to east of the Euphrates to continue to back their Kurdish allies. And lastly, and on this I'll conclude, lastly and perhaps most importantly for us, of course, the emergent conflict between Israel and Iran on the soil of Syria. Iran determined to consolidate its base, to continue to develop a project similar to its projects in Iraq and in Lebanon, in which it effectively hollows out the state in question and creates a kind of quasi-state subservient to Iran on the soil of Syria. Israel equally determined to prevent that. And I'll just conclude with a couple of sentences on that to say the following. Both Prime Minister Netanyahu and then Defense Minister Lieberman defined as a goal the need for Iran to quit Syria in its entirety. If we look at the pattern of Israeli activity with regard to Syria over the last years, mainly consisting, of course, of aerial bombing, including some clearly very impressive achievements from the point of view of air warfare, and if we look at the extent and depth of the Iranian project in Syria, which consists not only of bases, but also of proxy organizations, also of organizations ostensibly part of the regime itself. In my humble opinion, at least, as a citizen, there's a certain gap between the stated goal of Israel and the means which Israel appears to be looking to use to achieve that goal. In any case, be that as it may, last sentence to say, Syria, as we knew it before March 15th, so to speak, 2011, has ceased to exist. It's not coming back anytime soon. What we're looking at on that map is a fragmented and collapsed country in which, whichever way things develop in Syria in the period ahead, it will not be internal Syrian factors which will be deciding this. Rather, Syria has become what the late dictator Hafez Assad, in essence, devoted his life to trying to prevent, in many ways, which is that Syria has collapsed in itself, and it is now an arena for the playing out of rivalries between external stronger factors. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan.